Good afternoon, David Ruddy here. On behalf of Ian O'Hurley, Head of Education at Mason Hayes and Curran, I'd like to welcome you all to this, our second webinar for primary school leaders, Remote Education, the Legal and Technical Challenges. We're delighted to have over 1,000 participants with us today, and we apologise to the several hundred other people who couldn't join us. But happily, we have live streaming on the Mason Hayes Curran Facebook page to accommodate them. I'd also like to acknowledge the help of all those in relation to communication notice of the webinar. This includes our management bodies, and in particular, I'd like to thank Pat Goff, Deputy CEO of the Irish Primary Principals Network, IPPN. By notifying members via the networking and e-scale facility. I'm joined today by two members of our team, Fiona Sheil, who is a solicitor in the Education Department, and also from the Education Department, Paul Rochford, who is a partner. So thanks for joining me, Fiona and Paul, and they'll attempt to answer your many questions. Unfortunately, we had to disable the live question facility due to the volume of questions received, but be assured that the contents of this webinar is based on the broad outline of your questions and on concerns you have. And just to put you at ease, if you think we're going too quickly or that, Ian O'Hurley is going to email all the participants later with the slides and a link to the webinar, and IPPN will also post a link on their website. So I think we'll get started, and so we're going to look at the issues that you have asked us to consider, and the breakdown into two sections really, the Board of Management, as you'd expect, and the principal and staff. So we're going to look at governance issues, child protection goes through both themes, our duties as employers, and the issue of recruitment, which will be very much on your minds. And also the whole question of revisiting our data protection and security. So the first issue we're going to look at is the governance section. And you'll all recall last Christmas, you received the new governance manual from the Department of Education and Skills. And that coincided with the formation, of course, of all your new boards. And it does allow, as you know, for remote board meetings in exceptional circumstances, so that's taken as a given. You are obliged to record in your minutes that it is a remote meeting. And of course, the issue of confidentiality, like all face-to-face meetings, is still an issue. And I would say it would be a concern too. So we're going to just reference that briefly. Your board has to be quorate at all times. And you have to put in the normal preparation. You have to agree an agenda with the chairperson. And above all, when you're using our great friend technology, you have to do the testing as we would have done before we came on air, as it was, with your good selves. So just one of the first questions I'll put out here is in relation to and I'll put it to you, Paul, if you don't mind, is how do I deal with a situation where the signal drops during a remote board of management meeting, and this comes from an anxious chairperson? So these things we know can happen. So Paul, what's your take on it?
They can, David, and you know, we've all been in that situation where we've, no matter how much pre-testing we've done with our software package, something lets us down on a particular day. And I think it's a good idea for boards and for chairpersons to turn their minds to setting out the parameters and the rules that they're going to operate under in this unusual situation in terms of board meetings. As you say, the governance manual allows for meetings other than in person, but I think the manual, to be fair, envisages that as an exceptional circumstance rather than a regular event. So I think if the chairperson and all the members of the board clearly understand what's going to happen, if, for example, a link goes down, either on the side of the individual board member, or perhaps the chairperson as the host loses everybody, or he's lost or she is lost out of the room, So if they know what's going to happen, for example, if that person who drops out means that the board no longer has a quorum, then obviously certain things will have to follow from that. The meeting will have to be suspended until it can be reconnected. And you may wish to do that in any event. If not, if you still have a quorum, you may, try and contact that person by some other text message or something like that. And if they can't get back on, you may decide to proceed. And I think, look, as long as the board is clear and everyone is satisfied that they have a clear set of rules and that they're, adequately and evenly applied, I think, there shouldn't be any difficulty. We're obviously all going to have to try and make the best of this situation and deal with these issues as they arise. But I think the clear thing is, as we've said there, record all of these things in the minutes, make sure that they're adequately recorded, and that everyone is satisfied that the appropriate procedures have been followed.
Thanks for that, Paul. And the whole idea here, I think, is just to anticipate these things. And if you prepare for that, you'll get over the bumps, which will, as you say, inevitably will happen. And we're very conscious that many of our participants today are from maybe rural areas where broadband issue and signals can be an issue. And indeed, that can happen in urban areas too. The next question really is tied into this, and it says, what are the ground rules for conducting online meetings for the board? And I think one of the most important ground rules would be that you would all agree that there be no electronic recordings of a board meeting. That would be a starting point. I think each member of the board would have to confirm that they're participating on their own, that there's nobody else in the room. Because as I said previously, board meetings are held between the four walls, and confidentiality has always been an issue or a concern. So that there should be heightened awareness of that, and to ensure simple things that were not overheard. And as when we're working from home, you maybe have children in the background or other adults. So these are obvious things, but we just need to reflect on them. And maybe the chairperson at the commencements of the meeting would mention this. And simple things like a protocol for speaking, using the hand signal, and of course the agreed report at the end of the meeting. One of the issues that comes up at every board meeting, and it's always on the agenda, is the question of child protection. And Fiona, I'm going to direct a question to you, and it's put this way by a school principal, and what they say is child protection hasn't gone away. What is the role of the principal DLP in relation to a child protection oversight report? So Fiona.
Thank you, David. Yeah, that principle is correct. A school's child protection obligations have certainly not gone away. But as you can see from the slide there, no child protection oversight report is required to be presented to the Board of Management during this remote working period. Now, it's crucial that the principal retains all relevant data and records for the next physical meeting of the Board of Management. Child protection procedures very much apply still in relation to any concerns, so just to be mindful of that. But at this remote time, no report is required.
And I think the reason behind that is that the board, which has an oversight role, actually cannot get sight of the physical documents as such. Exactly. So, and as you correctly point out, at the next face-to-face meeting, all that must be dealt with then. And as far as I'm aware, the department have written to schools in relation to this, and the management bodies also. So thanks for that, Fiona. We're now going to look at another issue that is important to you, and rightly so, the board as an employer. And what comes through here is, the question is, how can a board be expected to promote health and safety when staff are working remotely from home? It's a good question. Fiona?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, this is a really challenging time for employers. You know, we're in very difficult and testing times for everybody, but from an employer's perspective, it's really important to check in with your employees. You know, the Board of Management is the employer of the staff, and it has a duty of care to its employees. In our own office, we have regular catch-up calls and meetings over Zoom, and we stay in contact over email and WhatsApp throughout the day. So even though we're not physically together, you know, it's important to still feel connected with your colleagues insofar as is possible. I think it's worth noting that, you know, if you notice an employee is struggling, and perhaps you might pick this up over a Zoom call, you should consider giving them a call privately and asking, is everything okay? And, you know, maybe consider giving them the details of Inspire Wellbeing, which used to be called Care Call. But I think the takeaway here is, you know, to keep that flow of contact alive.
And again, as you say, to watch out for somebody who may be more vulnerable than others. And that thanks for that, Fiona. Just another thing that occurs to me, I'm not sure whether our participants saw, I'm sure you did, and maybe yourselves, on the Monday night main 9 o'clock news, a school leader, a Dublin-based principal, Enda McGorman, principal of Mary Mother of Hope, was interviewed in relation to the whole question of schools potentially reopening. And one of the very interesting issues that Enda brought up was the whole question of, if social distancing is to be implemented, that in a class of maybe 25, 26 pupils, they may only be able to accommodate maybe 7 or 8. And then the question of hand sanitizers. Imagine if you've either 50 or 500 pupils, and perish the thought, face masks or whatever. Now, bearing in mind that there will be HSE guidance and, of course, department guidance on that, should the thought process be starting now in relation to reopening schools? Because I know that you're advising other non-school companies, and we are in the general employment department. Should we sort of just be thinking ahead? I don't know what your views on that would be. In relation to health and safety statement comes to mind, and risk assessment.
I think that's, look, forward planning and a certain amount of it is going to have to be done in the dark until we get a clearer picture of what the autumn is going to look like. But I think the comments from that TV program just highlight the need for boards as employers to be continually thinking about these subjects, to be planning for them. And while forward planning for the autumn should be going on, certainly that issue of health and safety, the question of the school's health and safety statement, both now in terms of people working at home and in the future in terms of what the autumn working situation looks like, is something that boards management should be turning their mind to and should be considering. Do we need to conduct a new risk assessment? Is there guidance, and there is out there, in relation to working from home? Have we dealt with that in relation to our staff? Have we engaged with them on it? And have we, done everything we can to ensure that our staff have the safest working environment possible? So, those are all things that boards should be thinking about, taking advice on, and planning for both, for the next few weeks and months, and then into the autumn.
Thanks for that, Paul. And what prompts me there is as a former school principal myself, I'm conscious that when July and August comes, or part of it, there is a switch off, and rightly so, annual school holidays. So the principals school boards don't find themselves in a situation at the end of August, if there is a plan, that they're playing, as it were, catch up in relation to even the thought process. And the next piece we're going to move on to is the whole question of recruitment. And I often find, Paul, when you're not at your desk, when we were at a desk in our offices, and that you were generally working down at the Workplace Relations Commission. And a lot of that work, and Fiona, you'd be involved in this too, would be in relation to defending boards, in relation to disgruntled employees and that. So with that in mind, we're always trying to improve practice and guidance so that we don't find ourselves in those situations. And the next question may be a lead into what we're doing. And it's, if I can read, given that the DES have plans to publish the main panelists on May 20th, it could be the end of June or even the start of July before the recruitment process starts in earnest. This is where, of course, the panels have to be cleared, and then you have supplemental panels on top of that. And this is a bit later than normal. I gather the department had issues in relation to communication with a number of schools. We may have to embark with the online recruitment process, or should we delay in the hope that we can recruit with the traditional face-to-face social distancing, obviously accepted? And the big issue here is, and risk not having our staff in place. And the principal finishes up with the piece, are we damned if we do and damned if we don't? So Paul, that's a toughie, isn't it? A tough question. And I can see where she is, that principle lies.
Yeah, it is a difficult one, and could be particularly difficult for a school where they're seeking to fill a senior role within the school, principal or deputy principal role, where you might want the comfort of that in-person meeting, which does bring with it more of a sense of familiarity with the candidate. But we don't know how the public health measures are going to unfold. So I think, we should be preparing, and boards should be preparing for the possibility that all recruitment competitions may have to be done via a virtual link over a video conference. And it's important to note that the relevant circulars, the provisions provided by the department allow for that. They allow for remote digital applications. They allow for remote interviews. Again, as with the board of management arrangements, they were envisaged for emergency situations only, perhaps where somebody was abroad at the time the competition was on. But now it's going to be the reality for a lot of places. So again, planning and perhaps the fact that the panel situation is not being cleared until later gives boards time for planning for this. Clear protocols as to how the applications are going to be accepted, of what forum or app or module you're going to use to conduct the interview, clear instructions to the candidates for those interviews, including things like when signals drop or if there's a difficulty with communication, and plan for those contingencies then as to how you're going to deal with that if the signal does drop. And then you have issues such as, again, recording. If a candidate sought to record an interview, how would you deal with that? You should be aware, the interview panel that are appointed, the board should make sure they're aware of how the system works, that they know or would know if someone tried to record an interview. I think recording interviews are not a good idea. We have a very clear line of authorities there in cases dealing with recruitment and promotion interviews about the treatment and the value of interview notes and scoring sheets. And that path has been well trodden in the law. Video recordings of interviews, not so much. So I think, a very clear instruction to both interview panels and to candidates that they wouldn't use recordings and would be warranted. And then the normal rules apply in terms of, it's incumbent on the panel to take good notes, to have a clear scoring scheme that they agree in advance, and to keep those scoring sheets and keep all of that data for the required period that is set out. So in many ways, the system runs as normal. It needs a little bit of extra structure around it to facilitate the situation we find ourselves in now.
So notwithstanding that the recruitment would be remotely done, that all the rules and procedures, and you allude to interview notes, etc., questions, criteria, that's all stuck rigidly to. Am I a stick in the mud or just in relation to, I get what you're saying in relation to recruiting SNAs and teachers. My only issue is in relation to the recruitment of a deputy principal or a principal of a school. I'm a bit uneasy about that. Do you think it can be done, or what would your take be on it? Or
I think, look, as we have for the past 7 or 8 weeks, we're going to have to be guided by the public health officials and their advice. I think, boards may very well, and they may be warranted in this point of view, that they prefer to wait until there is an opportunity to have an in-face person-to-person interview. And if that is possible under the guidelines at that time, then, it's up to them to make that decision to wait to do that. Of course, there are practical issues related to that, in that the candidates that they may have wanted to get may have obtained a position somewhere else by then. But from a legal point of view, as long as they are arriving in a position where they have staff in place and the principal in place, the deputy principal in place at the appropriate time, it's their option as to how they wish to conduct it. But as I say, we may find ourselves in a position where there is no choice, and because of the public health advice, we have to run it as a virtual competition. And while not 100% satisfactory, perhaps in certain circumstances, it does happen in a lot of other industries across the world. You know, interviews are done from one continent to another. So maybe it's just an indication of the new world we're traveling into now that's been hurried along by the coronavirus situation.
Paul, thanks for that insight. And I think the key takeaway from your piece there is await direction from the department and the management bodies, which will be based on best medical advice. Thanks for that, but it is doable. That's what the message I also take out of it. We're now going to move on again, and we're going to look at the whole interaction between teachers and pupils, which is great. And, you know, we're very aware in Mason, Hayes and Curran, particularly in our education section, of all the work that you are doing, and it's hugely appreciated by parents. So well done to you, and it hasn't been easy. In relation to the issue, and Fiona, I'm going to direct this question to you. This one comes: how can schools be expected to fulfill a child protection role apart from acting on disclosures? So apart from doing the statutory piece and reporting or referring, is there anything else?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we've all seen the reports in the media over the last few weeks that vulnerable children are at heightened risk of abuse and neglect during this pandemic. And teachers and principals can't spot this abuse and neglect as easily as you know, you're not physically seeing the children. But with that said, you know, there is a statutory obligation to ensure, as far as is practical, that children are safe from harm while availing of the school services. The child protection still very much apply, as I said earlier, in this remote setting. So the advice is, if you hear anything or if you see anything that causes concern, you know, strong consideration should be given to whether or not it warrants a referral. Teachers are mandated persons under the Children First Act 2015. You know, it's up to TUSA to make the call as to whether the referral meets the threshold. But definitely, if something is seen on the screen or heard on the screen, you need to consider whether a referral should be made. And you know, consideration should also be given to updating the school's child safeguarding statement. And I know Paul touched on this earlier, but you know, that this is usually done at the start of the school year. But now is probably a very good time to be looking at this. And you know, there's new risks associated with this new way of teaching, and they need to be looked at and assessed.
And Fiona, just in relation to that, and looking at our slides there, the schools are required to have a child safeguarding statement, and that's set in stone by the Department of Education. However, what was novel when this was brought in 2017 was the whole risk assessment piece that must go alongside it. Now is the time, would you feel, that the new risks should be considered and identified in the risk assessment?
Absolutely, David. Now is the time to be looking at that. Absolutely.
Okay, and putting safeguards, of course, in place.
Yes.
Come back to the question of video conferencing just a little later, but we're going to move on now to the issue of technology use. And Paul will take us through a few things, but I just, at the outset, maybe we'll throw a question to him. And this comes, I'm finding remote teaching challenging at times as teachers are using different platforms. Everyone is working hard and doing their best. Should I be more prescriptive? And this comes from a not so techie principal. So I think I can identify with that anyway from my time.
I can understand the difficulty, David, and I think, look, as you say, we know from our own experience within the team and anecdotally that, you know, teachers and schools and principals have been doing a fantastic job across the country for the students that they have. But it was all thrust upon us, as it was for everybody in society, in a very sudden manner, and people just got on with doing what they had to do. Without there wasn't any planning or any pre-thought given to it in a lot of cases, because it was a decision that was taken on very short notice. So I think, but even now at this stage where, you know, we've been involved in this remote teaching for a number of weeks, it's a good idea to look at what are we doing and how are we doing it. So the ideal scenario, the best case application is that you would have all the school staff and the students operating on the one system that has been approved by school leadership. And that includes, you know, whatever apps or websites you're using, and whatever mode of communication that is through whether it's through email or through some other program that allows communication via a website. All of your staff then should, you know, be clear as to how that works. There should be an engagement with the staff in relation to what equipment they have. Has it all been upgraded to the latest operating system so that all of the security features are in place? Are they up to date in terms of antivirus? Are they using only school approved email addresses to communicate with students and with each other? And has the board, the principal, the leadership of the school, has the due diligence been done to make sure that the programs or the software that you're using is secure? You know, and that's something that perhaps you might need some external assistance with or advice on. But I think it is incumbent upon school leadership to look at that and to make sure that's the case. And then things like, again, doing the paperwork. So most schools, all schools may probably have an acceptable use policy or an internet use policy. I would bet that it wasn't designed to cater for this situation. So, you know, we'd have to review that and look at whether an addendum might need to be published to make sure that everybody's aware of what the rules are in relation to this current iteration of school life that we have. And then, you know, in terms of where, because we're all human and everyone's operating in a more stressful environment now, you may have issues, you may have problems, and how do we monitor those, or how do we deal with those complaints or problems when they come up? So there are a lot of moving parts in that, but I think if you get it to a stage where you are using only approved systems and you're operating in that one kind of approved ecosystem of software and hardware, then I think it's going to make dealing with any issues that do come up a lot easier. And I think it tallies with the board and the school's responsibility towards its staff and its students from a legal point of view.
Thanks for that, Paul. And in relation to technical assistance, of course, the PDST technology group are there to support schools in relation to this and answer questions. So that's something that can be worked on. And moving on, we're going to just look at the whole question of data protection. And Fiona, I must say, I'm taken aback over the last year or so with the amount of data access requests that schools are receiving. And these are not straightforward. And I've observed you and we've discussed different request demands and that. So the question here is, it's becoming increasingly obvious that we need to update our data protection and acceptable use policies. So in light of your experience and work, Fiona, what should the school leader be looking for? And should any school leader when they embark on this work?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, strong consideration should be given to updating your acceptable use policy, or if you don't have one, you know, putting such a policy in place. It's important to cater for distance learning within that policy and provide that distinction between, you know, distance and on-site teaching. A lot of the templates available to schools, well, the ones that I've seen anyway, seem to be out of date and don't cater for the current circumstances which we find ourselves in. Transparency is key in an acceptable use policy, and I think it's a good idea to provide links and details around the various platforms that schools are using. And teachers, you know, they shouldn't really be deviating from the agreed platforms. You know, and we've touched on this already, but it's important to ensure that the most up-to-date security and privacy features are enabled on these platforms. And this is an easy thing to do, and it's certainly not too late to look at now. We're aware that that the school closures happened in a real frenzy and platforms were downloaded in a rush. So, this is something to go back and check. And in relation to a data protection policy, yeah, like it's a good time to be looking at your policies now, and a really important one in the current circumstances is your data protection policy. Be careful of screen sharing and what data is made available and visible to students, because you're responsible for what's on the screen, and it's really easy to share your screen. I've done it by accident a couple of times. So I think it's really about getting comfortable with the platforms and their functions so you can avoid these risks. And you mentioned data access requests. Yeah, we're kept very, very busy with these. We see an awful lot of them coming through, and they're still coming through in the current climate. And I think it's important to note at the outset that the time limits provided for under the legislation still apply. So technically, a school has 1 month to respond to a data access request. And like we have seen the DPC, the Data Protection Commissioner's Office, exercise a degree of patience with schools, but you still need to be aware of the time limits. What I would say is that it's crucial to engage with the data subject. And if you think you're going to have difficulty in meeting the 1 month time limit, you should ask for an extension of time, or try and limit the scope of the data which is being sought from a parent. We advised a school recently on a data access request received from a parent of a 6th class student. Now, the student in question had been in the school since junior infant, so there was an awful lot of data that the school had retained on this child. So we sought to narrow the scope of that request. But I guess the point is really to engage with the data subject's request, and don't just ignore it if it comes in. Try and be as proactive as possible in the difficult circumstances.
And Fiona, would it be your experience that it's often disgruntled parents that will seek these requests?
More often than not, yes.
Yeah.
More often than not.
And that can be difficult. Thanks for that, Fiona. We're now moving on to the issue of video conferencing. And there's a question here. Like a lot of people, I've never heard of Zoom until the last couple of weeks, and it's been our lifeline. So this questioner is, we're using Zoom to great effect to aid teaching and learning in our school. However, we have heard some horror stories about Zoom meeting bombing, and the teacher and the administrator in brackets, I was a teacher as an administrator, being locked out. Horror stories, Paul, have you heard any?
I've heard a few, David, yes. And I think anybody who's been watching social media has probably seen a few clips of them. Look, whether it's Zoom or any of the other platforms that are out there, and there are many, I think, there are a couple of things which sound a lot like common sense, but again, when we were thrust into this, we may not have sat down and had time to sit down and think about these in advance. So there's still time now to do this. So having an agreed set of rules as to how online classes will work if they're being given. That's both for the staff and for the students, for the children, and obviously then for their parents in the case of younger children. And part of that is understanding how the platform that you're using, whether it's Zoom or Cisco WebEx or Microsoft Teams or whatever, how does that work? So if I'm setting up a meeting, what are the security protocols that I can put in place to prevent an uninvited guest coming in on top of my class with my group of children? If I, as the teacher who's hosting the meeting, get kicked out of it because my Wi-Fi goes down or there's some other issue, what is the protocol we're going to employ? So can we set it up so that the meeting automatically ends? Or do we arrange to have perhaps a principal or a deputy principal or somebody else on standby that I can text immediately, say, you need to go in and shut down that meeting? I know there have, and I know one of the questions we got in advance of today was about a situation that was in the media recently where that happened and a child took over the class. So those are the things you need to plan for so that you can deal with them if they happen. And look, technology, like everything else, it's going to let us down occasionally. So there is a chance that something like that might happen. Again, tying into, you know, a lot of the things we've been talking about already, child protection and everything else, make sure that you as the staff member, as the teacher, make sure your staff members are in a proper location for delivering the teaching. They don't have family members going by in the background. They don't have perhaps, you know, more challenging artwork on the wall behind them that might not be appropriate for children of a certain age. You know, these are the things you might not immediately think about, but they are things that may cause problems because, you know, we don't know how families are going to react to what they might see on their child's screen. The other thing, as Fiona's already touched on in terms of data protection, sharing screens or posting pictures. So sharing screens, be mindful of what's on your screen before you share it. Don't put it up with your email program open and show them everybody's email addresses and perhaps email title lines that relate to particular children or other staff members. Be aware, both for staff and students, of the difficulties of taking screenshots of Zoom meetings or video meetings and posting them or sending them by email to other people. You know, that is a breach of data privacy. So these are all the things that we need to think about. And then some of the other things, such as turning off the chat function, perhaps with older children in primary school, in 5th and 6th class, perhaps, that they don't have their mobile phones with them while the video class is going on. They wouldn't be allowed to use them in the class in school, so they shouldn't be allowed to use them while they're sitting there at home. So lots of practical things, but lots of practical things that can give rise to legal difficulties if they're not thought about and implemented, and more importantly, that everybody is clear as to the rules of what they are, and that they know what the outcome will be if there is a breach of those rules.
So Paul, what I take from here is the classroom rules still operate even if remotely, and have your procedures, think this out and anticipate what may go wrong and have something in place there. And I have to say, I'm impressed when you talked about challenging artwork, because I don't see any artwork in your background. I have a harmless landscape, and Fiona, I kind of see what you have in yours, but we're all
I don't really know what it is, to be honest.
we're all compliant. No, thanks for that. The next thing we move on to, we're sticking with emails, and we're using these more than ever out of necessity. And this question, fairly straightforward question. Well, it is and it isn't. Or maybe, Paul, you can answer this. Can I, as principal, monitor work emails of staff? So, and they've distinguished this as work as opposed to personal emails of staff. Well, can I just say before you answer that a lot of us, and in a previous life, I used the software package Aladdin, and all emails, text messages, communications, notes, everything was on that for me as an administrator. And there was no deal. Everybody knew that. Every class teacher had their own then particular access. So with that in mind, what's the situation regarding work emails?
Well, to answer the question as it's posed, the concept of monitoring would imply that, you know, the principal is actively looking at the emails that go in and out of teachers' email inboxes to students and what. And probably principals and staff, teachers will be glad to hear that is not something that would be permitted. So that kind of ongoing monitoring would not be allowed under the data legislation and GDPR. What may arise, and this is why we had suggested that the teacher should use a work email that's been assigned and approved by the principal and the board, rather than their own personal email, is, you know, if an issue arises, if perhaps a complaint is made or some question is asked about some interaction that was had via email, that the facility is there, and while it's not monitoring, but it would be reasonable to request to have a look at that email to determine what the situation is. And I just say in a lot of schools, whether it's Aladdin or some other platform, a lot of those communications are already captured and they're there anyway and can be viewed at any time. But I think that is important both for the protection of the school and the board, but also the teacher and also the child. You know, and there's a continuous line of protection there is provided by that email system operating within an approved email address and email program. So that's probably the first point I would say in response to that. I mean, email, you know, while we've talked about video conferencing, it's also true that a lot of schools are not using video conferencing for various reasons, but they are exchanging email assignments with students and having them sent back. Email, as we know, as lawyers, are a fertile ground for data-related issues, data breaches. So, you know, I think it would be important that people are aware of the difficulties that misdirected emails can pose, that, you know, teachers and staff exercise care in relation to who they're sending the email to. Is the correct recipient? Have I got the correct attachment? If I'm sending, you know, mailing lists with using BCC, am I doing that properly, or am I doing it improperly, where I'm then sharing the email addresses of all of the recipients with all of the other recipients? And the issue, particularly for primary school children, is those are likely to be, and probably should be, the email addresses of the parents involved. So, you know, there will be all sorts of difficulties involved in that. And then in relation to the content, you know, that an appropriate kind of guidance has been given as to what's appropriate content and what's not. Look, most teachers will know this from the virtue of their experience and just common sense. But as we use something more over a number of weeks and we're interacting with students, you know, we may become a little bit less careful about what we say or how we phrase it. And emails are notorious for misinterpretation. So I would just say, you know, exercise caution. Don't be overly concerned about it, but I think it is something you need to pay attention to and to have a clear protocol in place so that everyone understands how it's supposed to work and that's then put into practice.
Well, thanks for that, Paul. And just one final question here, and it relates to the wonderful WhatsApp. The question here is, to the best of my knowledge, all schools and indeed our own school are using WhatsApp for staff communications. Is it a safe way to communicate? And I think the backdrop maybe for this would be a number of months ago, I think the GA, for example, decided that they would have their own dedicated app rather than WhatsApp. And we do hear stories about things getting out of hand. Is it a safe way to communicate, Paul?
Well, you know, if you ask, if you go onto the WhatsApp website, they will tell you, and this is the fact, that it is end-to-end encrypted. So, you know, people who are not in the group cannot access the messages. That said, people can forward messages. Phones get lost. You know, so what I would say is, if you are using it for sensitive discussions, for example, going back to our earlier in the presentation, for example, you have a teacher who becomes concerned about something of a child protection nature. I certainly wouldn't use it for that. You know, I might, you know, text the principal and say, I need to speak with you about something. When can I call you? And then have a telephone call with them in relation to it. But, you know, for those types of issues, or, you know, issues dealing with specific individuals, be they children or whatever, I would not use it for that, I think, because you don't have the same level of security in that things can be screenshotted or forwarded, or phones can be mislaid and picked up by other people. So I think, look, exercise a certain degree of caution in relation to that.
Okay, Paul, on that note, I'd like to thank yourself and Fiona for your insights. What we're trying to achieve today is to support you in your work as school leaders and to safeguard the important work that you're doing. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge other members of our team for their valuable insights. Liam Reardon, Catherine Kelly, and Eno Hurley. And please feel free to contact us if you have any concerns As I mentioned earlier, Ian O'Herlihy will mail you with a link to this webinar, and IPPN will also have same on their website. So thanks again for your participation. Keep up the marvelous work you're doing, and above all, stay safe. Thanks.